Thank you very much, Rafael, and thank you for that warm introduction. Can everybody hear me? I can't tell if I'm muted now. Okay, excellent. Yes, it's a real pleasure to do this masterclass. And I'm putting on my comparative political scientist hat. In some ways, my talk is a shameless plug for the comparative political method, which is really my sort of my DNA as a researcher. It's very much in the way that I was schooled, and it's also in my DNA as a person, having lived all over the world. My fundamental conviction is that you can't understand things unless you compare. This is really, the root of understanding. But also over time, I realized in terms of my own work that it explains the past, but of course, explaining the past, explaining path dependence, but also points of rupture and points of transition. This is a very valuable tool for foresight. So I always describe myself as more foresight adjacent than 100% pure foresight practitioner, as so many of you might be. But I still think that the comparative method really is a fantastic toolkit and a fantastic set of precepts. It's about rigorous curiosity, which I think really characterizes the best foresight methods. So today, my point is to argue that looking back and looking sideways is actually the best way of helping us to plan and helping us to look forward. In terms of the talk, I might have been a little bit ambitious in terms of the number of slides, so I might go a little faster for some than for others. But first, I want to argue that looking across borders, but also in terms of comparative politics, sometimes looking within the same border, but looking across time, is actually a much better way of explaining what's happening now, but also what's likely to happen later, and sort of beats, the kind of crystal ball crystal ball gazing, which I'm often asked to do in some of the policy work. Then I want to look at what I've called, intuitive lenses. One is the mirror, one is the ripple, and one is travel line. Sort of three metaphors that help us think of a kind of a sort of four-step routine that anyone really can run. And then finally, I want to do three mini stories that give examples. That I have selected stories that really don't draw on my own personal work about the far right or governance or transitions to authoritarianism. There's been so much work done on transitions to democracy, but I'm obviously looking at transitions to authoritarianism as well, given the times we live in. But I might substitute one of the stories for one that has to do with the far right, with trust, and with some of the work that I'm doing in Europe at the moment. So, to get started, essentially what I'm sort of saying is that what we have in comparative politics is we've got countries that are really live experiments. They are, in a sense, laboratories of politics and policies. That this is the easiest way to test ideas, as I say, without paying the tuition fee. These are free labs in some ways, right? That we can very easily track successes and stumbles that characterize the past, and that give us very strong hints about our future. And one way of thinking about this is that the comparative politics helps us turn surprises into what I call surprises into patterns, right? So it looked as though Germany's 2015 minimum wage U-turn, right? They had such a difficult time passing this. Nobody thought that they would go ahead and do it. It looked really quite shocking domestically. It looked like a U-turn, but from a European vantage point, actually the dominoes, had been tumbling for quite a while before in the UK. in the late 1990s in France, etc. So the cross-national view, I think turns into, it sort of turns U-turns into scheduled arrivals. It does mean that, we can weak signals much more readily. So I wanted to look at, sorry about this. I'm, I'm having, okay. Uh, I want to look very quickly. I mean, this may seem wonky to you, but actually, I think it's a really important way to ground what we are. It's a very important way of explaining why comparative politics and the canon of comparative politics, these names may not mean anything to you, but they are absolutely structuring of the way that comparative politics developed as a discipline. And I want to really show how these key concepts in comparative politics have real payoffs when it comes to foresight. And to some extent, many people would argue that the work by Jaworski and Thun, foundational paper in 1970 and a number in the late 60s, they start off the whole, the whole discipline of comparative politics, which in brackets, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that comparative politics sort of evolves in the 1960s out of a realization that until then, political studies had been very unscientific, right? Very few hypotheses. They'd been driven really only by historical knowledge, institutional analysis, but not a lot of work on variables, not a lot of work on, not a lot of use of a rigorous scientific framework where you construct a hypothesis, you look at the variables, you try and falsify a hypothesis. So comparative politics is very much about bringing that scientific lens, right, to the field of political analysis, which was kind of held responsible at the time for the blind spots that led to the tragic situations of World War I and of World War II. Political analysis hadn't helped us see these things coming, and so there needed to be a different kind of political analysis, a comparative political analysis that would deliver something more scientific and something that would help us predict in the way that science does, right? And this is part of why I think that foresight benefits so much from what comparative analysis brings. So the first works by Jaworski and Thun, really emphasize that you select your cases like a controlled lab study, right? Of course, you don't have the same thousands or hundreds of thousands of cases that you would have. Comparative politics has what people call a small n problem, right? A small sample size. But if you select your cases well, then actually, and it helps you look at variables in a more steady way. And it helps you isolate single drivers, which is what's important. And it ties into foresight because that driver that you've isolated becomes a primary indicator in terms of your what you might call your monitoring dashboard. Light part, basically focuses on variables. He underlines or rather, I would underline that, foresight practitioners, often juggle a lot of signals, some of them contradictory. It's about what, that phrase is about, finding the signal from the noise, right? Seeing the signal amongst the noise. And this is what Leipart, brings to this discipline. He reminds us to group variables into analytically useful clusters before we turn them into scenarios. So a fundamental step, to stress test your variables, but also a fundamental step in terms of making sure that you're picking the right indicators. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly on the others and skip forward to Theda Skocpol's work. Theda Skocpol's work being incredibly important here because she was was the first to sort of explain how path dependence is broken, right? Critical junctures. How do you explain a revolution? How do you explain the unexpected? What we might call today the wild card shocks, wars, pandemics, revolutions. These are observable inflection points in the historical record, and it anchors discontinuity, right? In scenarios, it helps us do that. I think my very favorite author in comparative politics, really foundational work. And again, this is fundamental, I think, for the work that we do when we engage in foresight, is the work of Barrington Moore. And Barrington Moore really tries to explain why you have democracy in some parts of Europe or the European landscape, and why you don't in others, right? And he basically makes a very bold claim. He looks at the trajectory of, say, Russia in particular on the one hand, and then different parts of Europe. And he comes out with this idea that if you have no revolution, you have no bourgeoisie, and therefore you have no democracy in the end. Or if the revolution comes too late, it's too late for the bourgeoisie to form and for democracy to emerge. And he also makes these judgments about the role of feudalism, for example, right? A feudal pathway versus a non-feudal and more almost slavery-based kind of work pattern, as you might have had in parts of southern Italy. And this is really important because, first of all, there's an elegance. I mean, I must say I'm a bit of a sucker for this. There's an elegance in this model. There's historical knowledge, but there's also the capacity to step back and sort of say, if this happens, then we might expect X, right? And you test all sorts of scenarios and all sorts of variables to come up with what is really a very elegant explanation. But most importantly, what he shows is how slow moving variables like class coalitions, for example, right, or regime emergence or work patterns emergence actually interact with much more fast moving variables. And I think that this is important because we know that good foresight sort of layers the slow tectonic plates under the really fast-moving surface signals. And how we tell one from the other is absolutely crucial to the work that we do. I want to go in a little faster here. I'm looking at, here another foresight payoff, foundational author, Robert Putnam, before he was famous for writing his Bowling Alone book that propelled him into superstar status in the nerdy world of comparative politics, actually wrote a really foundational text called Making Democracy Work, and basically about civic transitions in modern Italy. And it was an important work because it focuses on a comparison that is within national boundaries. His argument is that basically the variations in regional government performance in Italy has to do with civic traditions. And here too, there's first of all, a very fundamental idea that variation inside one country can kind of outshine cross-country averages, which is important for foresight work. But also he roots the analysis, in very deep historical knowledge, right, in civic traditions, and I think that this is incredibly important. I'm going to jump to Ostrom here, to Elinor Ostrom's work of the 1990s, where she looks at the outliers, right? She looks at what she calls the positive deviance. Instead of seeking the silver bullet, she looks for edge cases, right? That would tell us something both about how pathways might differentiate later on, but also how we got to the situation that we're in. And then I just want to finish on Sartori, and this is huge, hugely important because um, he forces us to look at what he calls the ladder of abstraction. He it's a kind of indicator hygiene test, right? That you define an indicator so that it can be measured and not just in the way that you feel it. And he's done a lot of work, for example, as I have, on issues to do with polarization. And on an indicator like that, polarization, as we know, particularly in the world that we live in right now, it's a hugely important, indicator of resilience of democracy, of potential democratic breakdown, and so on. But actually, it's incredibly interesting how often that view of polarization is very wishy-washy, right? It's sort of a felt variable. And so we can fall into the trap of looking, of as long as we feel it, we don't bother to measure it. Sartori is very, very clear about measuring these variables. So I want to connect all of these sort of scholarly bricks into some through lines, right? Um, Basically, isolating drivers lets us rank them by influence. Causal clarity allows us to create a really clear driver hierarchy. The idea of multiple pathways also, lets us look at scenario diversity in a really rigorous way. The flow versus fast variables, as I've said, drawn from a work like the one from Barrington Moore, although obviously, since 1966, other people have been involved in this, creates the focuses on the need for layered horizons, which I think, particularly in the current era where social media, creates an incredible level of noise in our analysis, that is particularly important. The critical junctures, enhance our capacity. The work by Scotchbull, for example, to map discontinuity, and then of course, the various mechanisms and networks that are at play give us the early warning signals, and then the Sartori idea of the concept discipline, the variable discipline, is an obvious quality control. It kind of immunizes us against buzzword-driven scanning about where it forces us to make sure that every indicator maps onto a really well-defined concept, right? So for me, the comparative method supplies foresight with these tested strategies for selecting cases. This is very much about how we select variables, how we select cases, isolates causes, maps contingencies, guards against bias. And I think all of this, shapes our view of plausible futures and the triggers that might get us there. Um, I'm going to go quickly over this because this is quite simple. I work with this idea whenever I do my work, the idea that we have mirror effects, similar places, different results. For example, Canada versus the US on cannabis legislation, and basically divergent federal structures that simply yield explanations, which is, the veto power of Washington, right? So that's one aspect. The ripple, the first mover sparks copycats, and for example, the New Zealand child poverty targets, are something that that sparked directly sparked in some ways in time in if we think of timelines, the reforms in Scotland and Wales, and then obviously the travel lines, that basically alliances, networks, all of this, they travel and they're part of the explanation. And there's been some very good papers on how the German energy transition directly inspired, India's solar boom, and who went and what kind of networks and so on. So Very clear four-step routine. The big question, will cities ditch buses by 2030? The important bit here is that it's time-stamped, a clear time-stamped decision point so that we know what exactly our benchmark is. The idea of scanning for early signs. I did some work on, the Shenzhen's electric fleet, which was important because, for us, for Foresight, what this tells us is that essentially the technical hurdle has been overcome, right? That's no longer going to be, one of the hurdles that cities feel that they have to overcome. Third, you match peers and patterns. Interesting work on the fact that Milan, Warsaw, Budapest, actually they share a fleet size, they share size, they share smog issues, and therefore, working with most similar cases, this helps us develop our foresight work. And then, of course, what you all know, which is that when facts change, for example, the price of batteries halves or the EU grants arrive, then you need to refresh your scenarios. So I'm going to go quickly on this because I'm happy to share the presentation.